My name is Grace Summers. I am 39 years old. I have a doctorate in molecular biology. I run a research laboratory at a university in North Carolina, and I have published 42 peer-reviewed papers in the last 12 years on genetic markers in early-stage cancer detection. Last Thanksgiving, my mother introduced me to her book club friends as her daughter who works in a lab, in the tone people use when they are trying to make something sound more respectable than they believe it actually is. The same evening, my younger brother Tyler, who sells commercial insurance and drives a company car and coaches his son's soccer team and represents, in my mother's private accounting system, everything a life well lived is supposed to look like, received a standing ovation for buying the family a new television. I ate the sweet potato casserole I had made and said nothing. What I want to tell you is not a story about bitterness, because I am genuinely not bitter. And if you spend any time in a research laboratory, you learn very quickly that bitterness is a luxury you cannot afford, because it takes up space that the work needs. What I want to tell you is a story about what happened 6 weeks after that Thanksgiving, when my research team published a finding that had been 8 years in the making, and the world found out about it before my own mother did, and what that sequence of events revealed about a gap in my family that I had been navigating my entire adult life without fully naming it. The finding was significant. I will describe it plainly, because plain is how it deserves to be described. We identified a panel of 4 genetic biomarkers that, in combination, predict the development of pancreatic cancer up to 3 years before any current diagnostic method can detect it. Pancreatic cancer kills most of the people who get it, because it is almost never found early enough to treat effectively. Our work does not cure it, but it is a step toward finding it early enough that treatment might actually work. The paper was published in a journal called Nature Medicine on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, it had been covered by the New York Times, the BBC, NPR, and approximately 40 other outlets I stopped counting after the first day. My phone did not stop ringing for 72 hours. My mother called on Saturday. She had seen something on the news, she said. Was that me? I want to go back before the publication, because the context matters, and because the publication without the context is just a success story. And success stories without context are not true stories. They are highlight reels, and I have spent enough time in science to know that the part of science nobody films is the part that is actually science. 8 years. That is how long this particular research thread had been running. I started it in the 3rd year of my faculty position, when I was 31 years old and had just received a grant that was large enough to staff a real team but not large, enough to insulate us from the pressure to produce results on a timeline that does not match the timeline science actually runs on. In those 8 years, we had 3 findings that did not replicate. 2 graduate students who left the program before finishing. 1 complete pivot of the experimental design after year 4, when our initial approach turned out to be flawed in a way we had not anticipated. A grant renewal process that required me to write 112 pages of justification for work that had not yet produced a publishable result. And approximately 400 days where I drove home from the lab at 9 in the evening and sat in my car in the parking garage, trying to decide if I still believed we were on the right track. My family's understanding of these 8 years was that I worked in a lab doing something with genetics. My mother occasionally mentioned to people that I studied DNA. Tyler once described my work to a friend as basically CSI but slower, which is not accurate but is not the worst description I have ever heard. At the Thanksgiving, where Tyler received the standing ovation for the television, I had been 3 months away from the finding. I did not know that yet. That is not how it works. You do not get a countdown. But 3 months away is 3 months away. And I was running on 5 hours of sleep and a grant deadline and the particular tension of a research thread that is either approaching a real finding or about to reveal itself as a dead end, and you cannot tell which until the moment you can tell. I ate my casserole and said nothing about any of this, because saying something would have required explaining something. And explaining something would have required my family to understand enough context to receive the explanation, and I had tried to build that context for 12 years, and it had not quite taken. The gap between my family's understanding of my work and my actual work is not a story about a family that does not love me. I want to be clear about this because the easy version of this story makes my mother the villain and Tyler the foil, and me the misunderstood genius, and none of those things are quite true. My mother loves me. She has loved me consistently, and in the ways she knows how since I was born, and the ways she knows how include cooking, and calling, and worrying about whether I eat enough, and introducing me to her book club friends, and not quite understanding what I do but showing up anyway. That last part, showing up without understanding, is actually a form of love that deserves more credit than it gets. What the gap is, really, is a translation problem. My mother grew up in a family where success was tactile and visible. You had a house, you had a car, you had children who were healthy and present and preferably living within 40 minutes. You did things that could be described in a sentence at a dinner table. I do things that require a semester of molecular biology to describe at a dinner table, and I have never quite found a way to compress 8 years of research into a sentence that lands with the weight it deserves. Tyler found the sentences easily because his work is made of sentences. He sells things, he explains things. He moves through a social world that runs on exactly the kind of clear and immediate communication that dinner tables reward. I move through a world of papers and datasets and replication failures and incremental findings that only make sense in the context of a literature that took decades to build. I have never blamed my family for the gap, but I will admit that sitting at that Thanksgiving table, while the television got a standing ovation, I felt the gap more acutely than I usually allow myself to feel it. And feeling it that acutely made what happened 6 weeks later more interesting than it might otherwise have been. My mother called Saturday morning, 2 days after the paper published. She had seen a segment on the evening news and recognised my name and my photograph, and she sounded the way people sound when they are recalibrating several things at once while trying to stay calm on the surface. She asked if that was really me in the news. I said it was. She asked if it was a big deal. I said it was significant, that the finding was being described as an important step in early cancer detection, and that the coverage had been more extensive than I had expected. There was a pause on her end that lasted long enough for me to hear her set something down on the counter. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me you were working on something like this?" And I thought about the 8 years. I thought about the replication failures and the pivot in year 4, and the grant renewal, and the 400 evenings in the parking garage. I thought about all the times I had tried to explain what I was working on, and watched her eyes go slightly soft with the effort of staying engaged with something she could not quite follow. And I said honestly, "Mum, I tried to tell you what I was working on for 8 years. It just didn't look like what it ended up being until it was finished." She was quiet again. Then she said something I did not expect. She said, "I should have asked better questions." That was the sentence that mattered. Not the news coverage, not the calls from journals and universities and science journalists, not the email from a congressman's office asking whether I would be available to speak to a health subcommittee. My mother, at her kitchen counter in North Carolina on a Saturday morning, saying she should have asked better questions. That was the sentence that closed something that had been open for a long time. Tyler called 2 days after my mother. He is 3 years younger than me, and we have a relationship that is warm but abbreviated. The relationship of two people who love each other and have very little to talk about, because their worlds do not overlap in any way that makes conversation easy. He called and said he had seen the news, and that it was impressive, and that he had not known I was working on something that important. I told him I had been working on it for 8 years. He was quiet for a moment, doing the math, which put the start of the research thread at roughly the same period when he had made the comment about it being basically CSI but slower. He did not reference that comment. What he did say was that his son's school had a career day coming up, and that he had been trying to think of someone interesting to bring in. And would I be willing to talk to a class of 11-year-olds about what scientists actually do? I said yes immediately, because if there is one thing I have learned in 12 years of research, it is that the best time to show a person what science actually is happens before they have decided it is not for them.